ask you to think of a famous inventor, who comes to mind? Is it Thomas Edison? Maybe it's George Washington Carver. Maybe it's Henry Ford or Steve Jobs. Maybe it's someone closer to home. Is it Madam C.J. Walker? Maybe it's Aqua Chanel. Or maybe it's Gary's own Robert Kearns, who invented the inventor windshield wiper. Now, I don't know if I told you that this whole idea of inventing, therefore the inventor, is an absolute myth. None of these people invented a thing. Yes, they're all famous for what they put out into the world, but what they created was not truly new or unique. After all, Henry Ford's museum in Detroit is called the American Museum of Innovation, not the American Museum of Invention. In his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond discusses this myth of the famous inventor. He says they're basically propped up by modern patent laws. They simply get credit for it. But that every one of these people had capable predecessors and successors that took their ideas and ran with it. They simply benefited from putting their ideas in the world at a time more capable of perceiving it. And this idea that there is nothing new is not a new concept. About 3,000 years ago, there was a wise and wealthy king. The Bible tells us that King Solomon was the richest and wisest person the world had ever seen. One day, he was strolling around his kingdom, taking stock of all his possessions, and reflected to himself in Ecclesiastes 1, 9, and 10, there is nothing new under the sun. Everything that has been will be again. But what if he was wrong? After all, over the course of 3,000 years, we've certainly seen a lot of new technologies and innovations enter into this world that King Solomon could have never imagined. Benjamin Franklin couldn't famously fly his kite until the 18th century. Thomas Edison didn't patent the first light bulb until 1879. And he certainly didn't tweet that observation from a tiny computer that he was storing in his pocket. But what if he was right? After all, a lot of the raw materials and substances and parts that we use to make things today were a lot of the parts and materials that King Solomon and his people would have used 3,000 years ago. We know there's 118 different elements, 94 of which are naturally occurring. We still use many of those elements today. We use fluorine in toothpaste or polonium in anti-static brushes, for example. It's estimated that there's almost 5,400 different minerals on Earth, and that there's nearly 90 million different species, including animals, organisms, and plants. I'm no mathematician, but it's safe to say that even over 3,000 years, we haven't yet begun to explore all the possible combinations, remixtures, and developments that we can use with those parts. I think both answers are right in a way. Yes, it is true that a lot of the parts we use today to make things were some of the naturally occurring parts that they used 3,000 years ago. But it's also true that over 3 millennia, we have been able to breed, develop, and upgrade a lot of those parts into new things. Solomon certainly didn't have a labradoodle running around his castle either. I'm here today to argue against the idea of invention, but I'm not here today to argue against the idea of the new. I believe that nothing under the sun was invented, but that everything under the sun was innovated. And that idea of the genius innovator, or genius inventor, it does seem a little unapproachable, seems a little intimidating. But the idea of the innovator, on the other hand, does seem a little more doable. But innovation, what does that even mean? In its simplest form, I believe that innovation is simply a new solution providing value to the community. It's solving unmet need in a new or different way. I believe that anyone can be an innovator, and that innovation can come from anywhere. Over the last 15 years, I've had the benefit of building and running innovation networks across the state of Indiana. I've met a lot of creative and interesting people, but more importantly, I've had a front row seat to seeing how innovation and problem solving works, both at the grassroots level all the way to large international corporations. What I want to share with you today is some of the lessons I've learned through first-hand practice and that front row seat of observation to prove to you that you are an innovator and that you are the ones capable of solving the problems that you see in your own community and in the larger world around you. Anyone can be an innovator if you connect the dots. That's all innovation is, simply connecting the dots. And if you want to connect more dots, you have to collect more dots. Or in other words, if you want to have one good idea, you must first have a lot of ideas. And here's the thing about ideas, they build on themselves. If I have an apple and you have an apple, and we need to exchange those apples, well, we're both going to walk away still with just one apple. But if I have an idea and you have an idea, and we need to exchange those ideas, now we're both walking away with 2 different ideas. Now just imagine that scenario playing itself out more and more the more people we meet. If you want to connect more dots, you have to collect more dots. Anyone can be an innovator when you rediscover that you are creative. And yes, you are creative. Researchers estimate by about the age of 5, we're using about 80% of our creative potential. We're imaginative, we role play, we color outside of the lines. But sadly, by about the age of 12, that number drops to 5% of our creative potential. And it generally stays that way for the rest of our life. By middle school, we no longer think of ourselves as creative. But you are creative, and it's been that way from the beginning. Genesis 1:27, for God made mankind in his image. Don Hunt is an American film producer, best known for his work with Disney and Pixar. In his book, Brainstorm, Unleashing Your Creative Self, he notes this reference and thinks to himself, if God is the ultimate creator, and I'm made in the image of God, then somewhere deep inside, I must be pretty creative too. And here's really the biggest lesson that I've learned in that front row seat to innovators. I've had the opportunity to run, plan, host, and attend hundreds of different events related to creativity and innovation. And quite simply, when people are given an opportunity to be and to feel more creative, they walk away being and feeling more innovative. When you feel more creative, you feel more innovative, and you carry that into your work. That could be through a role-playing game, maybe it's an improv-based workshop, maybe it's just sketching or drawing or doodling, or working with your hands, prototyping with Play-Doh. Maybe it's simply a brainstorming activity when you're actually given the opportunity to express your own creative opinion. How can you sprinkle a little bit of play into your day? How can you flex that creative muscle? Anyone can be an innovator by meeting more people. Innovation is a team sport. It doesn't happen when we withdraw ourselves from the world, but rather when we engage with it. Thinking about connecting those dots, artist Paul Klee, I think, has a really good illustration. He says that a line is a dot that went for a wall. How do we think about all those ideas we're collecting, and certainly all the people we're meeting, and taking that idea from a wall? How do we draw that line from one person to the next? The early entrepreneur, Tony Hsieh, would often talk about how we all have the opportunity to create our own luck, to maximize serendipity. He said the goal should be to meet as many people as you can without trying to extract value from them. And if we think about each person that we meet as a new dot on our own canvases, then over time we'll naturally see those connections. And here's the other thing about meeting people. We often talk about networking as something we do, it's a verb. We need to go out and network to build our business. I challenge you to think about network as a noun. How do we think about the people that we meet to add them to nodes to this mutually beneficial network of people that we're building? Network is a noun. We can be more innovative by reigniting our curiosity. To be curious is simply to be more observant and to interfere rather than learning more things about the world. Leonardo da Vinci is certainly one of those hero innovators that belongs on any list. Walter Isaacson wrote a biography on Da Vinci a few years ago, and in it he describes this maniacal, almost obsessive curiosity that really was a big part of driving his success. Leonardo was fascinated about everything in the world around him. He was also a relentless journaler. Leonardo kept journals, he filled them to the brim with notes and sketches. He filled the margins of those journals with notes and sketches. He filled the margins of those journals with notes and sketches. And during his research for the book, one of those margin notes caught Isaacson's attention. Leonardo had wrote to himself, describe the tongue of a woodpecker. Now, we don't know what he possibly could have meant by that. Maybe he simply observed a woodpecker out in the wild. After all, a woodpecker's tongue is about 3 times the length of its beak. If you saw that, you'd probably be fascinated by that too. But what we can imagine is Leonardo da Vinci taking a break, he's strolling through the forest, curious and observant about the world around him, just simply looking for ideas and inspiration. How can you be more curious? What are you interested in learning more about? Where can you go observe that? Anyone can be more innovative by refreshing old ideas. There's an African concept from the Twi language of Ghana called Sankofa. It means go back and get it. It's often associated with a proverb that says, it is not wrong to go back for that which was forgotten. Ndubuisi Ekekwe, regular Harvard Business Review contributor and author, writes about the concept of Sankofa innovation. This is the concept of painstakingly reaching back into history and finding old ideas, concepts, and tools, and bringing them forward to today to improve on them and create new techniques going forward. In 1955, Walt Disney reached back to grab 3 old ideas. He took the fairy tale, animation, and the ornamental garden to launch the world's first theme park. And some of those ideas were just simply put into the world at the wrong place at the wrong time. In 2013, I was working for a company out of Israel and had a chance to visit this company, Better Place, outside of Tel Aviv during one trip there. Better Place was in the process of revolutionizing the automobile industry. Their business model was going to charge consumers and companies driving by the mile to drive vehicles, similar to cell phone companies were charging us by the minute to use cell phones. They were building an infrastructure where you would simply drive your car into a station, it would swap out the battery with a fresh one, and you'd go on your merry way. You probably haven't heard of Better Place because they don't even exist today. They were an epic failure. But with the rise of companies like Tesla, with the rise in the use of electric vehicles and the infrastructure to support those vehicles, we can certainly picture how some of those ideas Better Place had touched 8 or 9 years ago may be brought back to today and be relevant. Sankofa. And finally, anyone can be an innovator if you repurpose ideas. How can you borrow and steal your way to innovation? Let's revisit that woodpecker. Da Vinci was curious about the tongue of the woodpecker. It is, in fact, about 3 times the length of its beak. It's made that long to dive down into all the tiny holes it's boring in the trees to get its food. But modern neuroscientists were also curious about the woodpecker, but for a slightly different reason. They saw a bird that was banging its head against a tree all day and thought to themselves, hey, why don't woodpeckers get concussions? Well, it turns out the tongue is actually part of that solution. They have this extremely long tongue that has to go somewhere when it's retracted back into its head. Well, it turns out the woodpecker's tongue does retract in, wraps around the neck, up and around the skull. And in the process of doing so, that tongue rolls around the neck, slightly pinching the jugular vein, cutting off some of the blood flow to the bird's brain. This creates a buildup of blood and fluid, basically creating a protective sac for the brain. There's just less room for it to slosh around, limiting the risk for injury. Doctors at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital discovered this, and they replicated it through this device you see in front of you called the Q-collar neck device. It snaps around your neck and basically does the same process. It slightly pinches your jugular vein, cutting off some of the blood flow to your brain during repetitive play, creating a protective sac of blood and fluid. There's less room for your brain to slosh around. There's less risk of you getting concussion. Luke Copley was a star linebacker for the Carolina Panthers. He was the first NFL player to wear this device in 2017. Here's our good friend Henry Ford again. Yes, he's known as the famous inventor. He created the assembly line. That's just not a true story. Henry Ford was absolutely a great businessman, and he should be studied. But he was an even better thief. Henry Ford would often go around his competitors to other industries looking for ideas to steal. He was passionate about trying to find more ways to make more cars faster and for more money. On a trip to Chicago in 1812, he visited the Swift Armor meatpacking plant. What he discovered there was the disassembly line. Workers were staying stationary and the meat would come to them. This workstation was brought to the workers rather than the workers going to the workstation. He visited the Singer sewing machine company and discovered the manufacturing of interchangeable parts for the machines. And in the canning industry, he discovered the automatic conveyor belt. That had been used there since the late 1800s, but it was brand new to the automobile industry. So by stealing those 3 ideas and putting them together, he was able to build the assembly line that we all know him for today. Nothing new comes from nowhere. Every good idea had capable predecessors that led to that development. And every good idea today is going to have capable successors that will continue to improve developing new techniques going forward. I'm going to leave you with a short spoken word piece that my good friend Indiana Jones here wrote and performed when he stepped outside of his comfort zone at a place called Camp Grounded, summer camp for adults. You are an explorer, a curious collector. Do not just explore countrysides, but explore new ideas and experiences. You are a connector, a master of serendipity. Explorers collect, and the curious connect. Venture outside of your silos, outside of your boxes, outside of your comfort zones, outside into nature. If you want to connect more ideas, you have to collect more ideas. Talk to strangers and be strange. Try a new experience. Visit somewhere unexpected. Innovation doesn't happen when we withdraw ourselves from the world, but rather when we engage with it. And the world is a laboratory of ideas waiting to be explored.